Welcome, Fey, Miles, and friends, to another episode of Reading with Grams. Today's book is The Tuttle Twins and the Fate of the Future by Connor Boyack and illustrated by Elijah Stanfield. The fryer beeped, exclaimed Emily exclaimed as she and the other children rushed into Fred's kitchen. Mrs. Wanaka set the pan of Madaza on the counter to cool. Ethan's mouth began to water as he watched her sprinkle sugar on top. This looks just like the picture in the books we read about Uganda, Aaron said as his mother smiled wildly. That's right, she replied. This treat is very popular in my family's culture. I'm sure you will all just love it. I'm sure I mispronounced the name of that treat, and I'm sorry. Ethan and Emily and many other children from the neighborhood loved participating in Fred's book club. Each family took turns choosing a theme for the month and organizing an activity to help them share what they've learned in the books they chose. Aaron wanted to share about Uganda, a country in Africa where his mom grew up, and so he chose People of the World as his theme. Making and eating mandaza together was the activity. The other children had read about different countries, and they all wore traditional clothing of the cultures they had learned about. I hope you and your sister picked a theme that was also has yummy food, Mr. Tuttle told Ethan between bites. This stuff is so good. It was the twins' turn to pick the next theme, but they weren't quite sure what to do yet. That evening, the Tuttle family had a movie night. Mr. Tuttle decided that they would watch a dystopian movie, a story that describes an awful future where powerful people usually control others. The movie showed a world of poor people forced to work in jobs they were given by those in power. Anybody who fought back was taken by robots and sent to work on an asteroid as space slaves. Some rebels fought back and won, setting everybody free, but the plot still bothered the twins. Good thing that was fiction, right? Mr. Tuttle exhaled in relief as the movie ended. I wonder if the future could end up like that, Emily said nervously. Everybody was being bossed around by people who controlled the robots. Dystopian fiction can become a reality if we let it, Mrs. Tuttle replied as she went to put the ice cream away. Hey, who ate all the cookies and cream? During the bike ride around the neighborhood the next morning, Mrs. Tuttle noticed the twins yawning repeatedly. Didn't sleep well, she asked. Ethan admitted that he and Emily were so unsettled by the movie that they stayed up for hours talking about the future. But we did decide on the theme for the book club, Emily said, the future, and how we can make it better so that all dystopian stuff never happens. Great idea, Mr. Tuttle replied, squirting Emily with his water bottle as she tried to catch him. What book will you two read? The twins didn't know, but they knew someone who could help. Not surprisingly, they soon found themselves at Fred's house to get some suggestions. He had an expansive selection in his office. The twins wanted something with a futuristic theme, so Fred led them to a shelf with science fiction and fantasy books. I don't want anything dystopian, Emily mentioned. I need my beauty sleep. And too many kids' books just treat us like little babies, Ethan replied. We want to read something that makes us really think hard about how to make the future better. Fred said, taking a step back to look at his collection. I definitely have plenty of books that fit that criteria. Ethan walked to the bookshelf where Fred kept the book, The Law, that they had once borrowed. What about this one? Ethan asked, taking a book written by someone named Murray Rothbard. I overheard Dad mention this guy before. That one will definitely challenge you, Fred laughed, but it might be a little hard to understand. But if you want to avoid a dystopian future, it will definitely help. You two seem to be up to the task. Anatomy of the State, Emily said, reading the title. Does it talk about parts of the body? It must. There's a drawing of somebody's inside on the cover, Ethan replied. But what's the state? That's what the book will explain, Fred replied. Look here. He set a globe in front of them. These areas of the world are occupied by different nations, and each is controlled by a state, he said. The twins noticed how the land was divided by black lines that cut the globe into different nations. But I thought the state is a state like Texas or New York, Ethan asked. These are all country. Yes, Fred responded, but the state is also a type of government that controls a certain area on the globe, whether it's a small city or a large nation. Remember the theme of our last book club? Fred asked. We all learned about people around the world, different societies, which are a group of people who live and work together voluntarily. Over time, these societies have created cultures, different foods, clothes, music, language, and religions. It's really fascinating to see what people can create when they work together like this. That sounds like what Carl talked about at the pencil factory, Emily said, spinning the globe. People around the world work together to make a simple pencil, even though they are in different states, I guess you would say. That's a great example, Fred replied. A state is limited to just areas it controls, but through society, we can work together with others, whether it's our neighbors or people around the world. Fred stopped the globe from spinning by placing his finger on France. My parents were born here, he said, and the people in the society are great. So is the food, he said with a big smile. Ethan pointed to Scotland. Here's where some of Dad's family's from, and that's where Mom's family comes from, Emily added, pointed to Sweden. She also found gold star Aaron had placed over Uganda. Each of these societies are full of interesting people who work together, Fred explained. But these nations all have a state, which is a type of government. You will see how this book talks about the parts of state, its anatomy, make and how that makes it so different from society. Fred told the twins that he would alert the club about their theme for the month and that he was excited to see what they would learn. Mr. and Mrs. Tuttle were preparing dinner on the backyard patio when the twins returned, holding out the book Fred had let them borrow. Fred gave you Anatomy of the State? Mr. Tuttle said in surprise. This is going to be interesting. He thinks learning about the state will help us avoid dystopian stuff in the future, he replied. Sounds pretty wise, Mrs. Tuttle replied. Have you two given any thought to an activity? Not yet, Emily said as she sat down. Ethan sat out dishes while Emily skimmed the book. There were many passages that Fred had already highlighted. Listen to this, Emily said. It says the state is a systemization of a predatory process over a given territory. Huh? Ethan said, looking confused. This might not be so easy, Mrs. Tuttle smiled as he grabbed his phone. Let me show you what it means. Ethan and Emily watched as their dad played a video he found on the internet of a leopard chasing a gazelle in the African savannah. The gazelle darted around trying to escape, but it was no match for the leopard. Mr. Tuttle paused the video as the leopard began eating its new meal. The gazelle was the prey, he explained. What do we call the leopard? The predator, the twins announced in unison. Mr. Tuttle loaded another video after sneaking a few bites of corn. This one was a story Uncle Ben worked on about rival gangs fighting over an area of the city. Ben interviewed a shop owner who described what it was like living under the control of the gang and how they made him pay money every month, otherwise, they would hurt him and destroy his business. These gangs wanted jurisdiction, the ability to control what happens on a certain territory, Mr. Tuttle explained, and they used coercion, which means that they used violence and threats of violence to get what they want. So they're the predators and the shop owners are the prey, Emily observed. Exactly, Mr. Tuttle replied. But what they are doing is illegal, so the police try to stop them. And if you or I try to bully people in our neighborhood like that, we'd be in a lot of trouble. That brings us to the last point, Emily, Mrs. Tuttle said. You're reading about predators in a certain territory becoming part of the system, becoming the normal and accepted way of doing things. Most people in charge of the state want to do good things and help people. They're not trying to be bad like gangsters, Mr. Tuttle chimed in. And many states let the people who live there vote and help decide who should be in charge. But even though societies are all different, there are one thing about the states that's always the same. What's that? Ethan asked. Well, the state always uses coercion against people who might prefer to do something differently than what the state wants, he replies. Even if the people in charge are nice, forcing others to do things leads to many problems, Mrs. Tuttle remarked. Unfortunately, the problems with the state aren't just in fiction books, Mrs. Tuttle added, setting out the food. There have been states throughout history, and we can see how they've turned out. She explained how societies want to protect themselves from criminals and invaders, so they form a government and give it power to protect them and defend their lives and their properties. But that part sounds fine, Emily commented as she scooped up the baked beans onto her plate. There are plenty of bad guys in the world. That's true, Mr. Tuttle said, but these governments tend to always expand their power. Instead of just protecting people, they began controlling them and limiting what they can do. The government begins acting less like a protector and more like a predator, Mrs. Tuttle said, and that is wrong because we shouldn't be prey. That explains why those dystopian stories are so awful, Emily said, thinking about predators but controlling people. It's like the golden rule, Ethan said. Chief Ron said it's never okay to use force against an aggression, only in defense. But we don't want to be bullied or attacked, so we shouldn't do it to others, and neither should the state. This is also like what we have learned about in the law, Emily added. True laws protect our rights from bad guys, but if the laws are used to control everyone, bad things can happen, and people began to use the law to boss others around. Here's another sentence Fred highlighted. Ethan said, taking the book from Emily. The history of mankind may be considered as a contest between peaceful cooperation and coercive exploitation. And that about sums up what we just talked about, Mr. Tuttle replied. There are two ways to work with others, through coercion or with persuasion. When you convince somebody by explaining something in a way that changes their mind. Businesses have to convince people to work for them and to buy their products. They don't force them. And churches and community groups ask for donations and rely on volunteers for help. Mrs. Tuttle chuckled softly to herself. Can you imagine a business owner or church leader chasing people down like predators? We're not gazelles. We're people with rights just like them. Yeah, our societies wouldn't allow that, Ethan said. You're right, Mr. Tuttle responded. The people of our city were very upset when they found out that it was Bob, the restaurant owner, asking the mayor to send the police to shut down the food trucks. And with your help informing the public, that food truck fiasco didn't last long, Mrs. Tuttle said proudly. But here's the big question. If most of us agreed that it is wrong to use coercion in society, why do people allow the state to act that way? They're really powerful, so do we even have a choice? Ethan asked as they passed around a mouthful of peas. Bob didn't want consumers to have a choice. He wanted a monopoly. He wanted to be the only one selling food, Emily added, looking over at Ethan. And what do monopolies hate? Competition, Ethan said, snapping his fingers. I see the problem. Every country is run by a single state. It's like there's one big business in charge of making the rules for the whole area. People really don't have a choice. Mrs. Tuttle smiled, seeing her twins work through the issues. Here's what Rothberg says about it, she said, opening up another highlighted passage. The state is an organization and society which attempts to maintain a monopoly by the use of force and violence in any given territorial areas. It's like Nana said at the ice cream shop, Ethan remembered. When there's no competition, the business can do a lousy job, but still charge everyone lots of money. Sounds awful. Bingo, Mr. Tuttle added. The state never has to rely on persuasion to get what it wants. It has a monopoly no matter what. The state created serfdom when they took the Sanchez family's land to build the new road, Ethan remembered out loud. Now hardly anyone goes to La Playa and all the businesses had to close. But guess what? Emily said, getting a bit riled up. There's one business that didn't close, the state. It caused all those problems and doesn't have any competitions to challenge it. Everyone quietly pondered what they have been discussing as they did the dishes together. It's important to reflect on the stories from the past, and even things like the food truck fiasco and the problems with serfdom, Mrs. Tuttle remarked. If you care about the fate of the future, history is very important to remember. Answer to our questions can also be found in lessons from the past. The twins still hadn't decided on an activity, but continued reading each day as the next book club meeting drew near. There's one thing I don't get, Ethan said while playing one evening. Mr. Rothbart thinks that the state isn't good, but there has to be a government, right? Or how else would society have laws? Actually, a government exists whenever a group of people chooses rules they agree on. Mr. Tuttle explained, my company has rules and people in charge. There's a process to govern things. Same thing with our church and your book club. The state is one type of government, but in society there are other types that don't use coercion, Mrs. Tuttle added. Our family even has a government. But we don't get to vote, Emily remarked, flying a Lego spaceship towards her dad. That's right, Mrs. Tuttle added. I just don't go starting a revolution on us. I don't want any competition for being the boss. I have an idea for an activity, Emily said. How about we call it the fate of our future? Each family gets a problem to work on, and they have to come up with a way society can help solve the problem with persuasion instead of coercion. Coercion. Blech. And we can build a Lego society that only uses persuasion. Ethan said, it'll be undystopian. You mean utopian? Mr. Tuttle smirked. That is the opposite of dystopian. Ethan, you asked if there should be a government. Mrs. Tuttle said, we do need a set of rules to help protect us from predators. But ideally, the government would persuade you to do business with them. Rather than bully people, they would have to be very nice and fair, just like the businesses we shop at every day. They would have to do their best to serve customers. They definitely wouldn't tolerate any predators working for them. So the state is okay as long as they have to use persuasion, right? Emily asked. Well, remember, Mr. Tuttle responded, the state is a monopoly, and so they don't want any competition. Persuasion is important, sure, but it won't really happen unless different governments can compete against each other for your business. Society is amazing because there are so many choices, Mrs. Tuttle added. From the food we eat to the entertainment we watch, we have options, and that makes life interesting and helpful. So imagine if there were more choices for the state, for the government we live under, she added. Wouldn't it be better with more options? I'm excited for your activity, Mr. Tuttle said, and here's why. Read the very last thing in the book. Perhaps new paths of inquiry must be explored. Emily read, if success and final solution of the state question is ever to be attained, perhaps your group will come up with some creative solutions on how we can live in a society without having a state. Mr. Tuttle winked as he sent them upstairs to get ready for bed. As Ethan thought over what he and his sister had learned, his mind turned to the project and activity. How could a dystopia future be avoided? How do you stop a monopoly? And how do you create a society where people resolve problems without relying on coercion? It sounded like an awful lot for two 9-year-olds to think about. But after all, they did tell Fred that they wanted to read something that would make them think hard about how to make the future better. Saturday came quickly, and all the families in the book club arrived at Fred's house eager to talk about the future. The children gathered around the bin full of Lego bricks in the living room as the twin Tuttles explained how the activity would work. Remember, Ethan announced, we need to think about how we can avoid a scary future where the state controls us. Because if the people in charge have huge robots that can boss everyone around, Emily assigned each family a problem to solve without using coercion and relying on the state. After a bit of time to think it over, Aaron and his mother volunteered to present first. Our problem was helping poor people. Aaron said, we think society can take care of the poor by creating an app that lets people see who in their neighborhood is in need. So they will be more willing to help. Families and friends can use it too. In a dystopian world, taxes are really high, another child said during their turn. Our ideal is that a state should be like any other company where you pay for what you use. My dad said it's called a user fee. That way, people don't have to pay for things that they don't want. In a story I read, the government censors important books, controls the media, and wouldn't let people share their beliefs, another group member said. But with the internet, people can share ideals online and get around censorship. So the state can't simply ban books anymore. Our ideal is to make a website that lets people share information without being censored or controlled. These stories have one state in charge of everyone, Fred said. So competition is the solution. What if there were different companies you could choose from for protection and justice, no matter where you lived? Then they would compete for your business, trying to keep you happy with low prices and the best services, just like other businesses and organizations do. The families began to build with Lego bricks to show their ideals. The twins loved using creative things to get to imagine a better future. There's a name for this concept, Fred remarked as Ethan and Emily were hard at work. It is called polycentric law, when two or more governments compete in the same jurisdiction. Polycentric law? Mrs. Tuttle slowly said. That's a mouthful, but I love the idea. The twins finished up and began walking around the room to see what each family had done. Their ideals were clever, from the chaos of the colored bricks scattered around the room came some fun concepts and fortunately no predator bites. When you think about it, the fate of the future is really in your hands, Mr. Tuttle said as the family helped Fred clean up afterwards. Why do you say that? Ethan said. Because the future isn't set in stone, Mrs. Tuttle replied. You get to help change people's minds so they use society instead of the state to get what they want. You can help create a future where people are free to choose for themselves. So, what do you twins have to say? Since you're in charge of the future, will you will it have more coercion or more persuasion? Fred asked. Persuasion for sure, Emily replied. That is, unless I'm in charge. Then we'll call it Emilytopia, she declared as she began acting like a predator. Not a chance, Ethan said. Ethantopia will be some tough competition for you. The end. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Reading with Grams. Fey Miles Grams loves you. I can't wait to see you again, to give you hugs and kisses, and to share my love with you. Until next time, be good, subscribe, and until next time, bye!